January 20th, 1953. The early morning sun cut through a brittle, icy haze that clung to the streets of Washington, D.C. A pale light reflected off the frost-encrusted steps of the U.S. Capitol, where the nation had gathered for the solemn ritual of transferring power. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and leather gloves, mingling with the nervous energy of thousands lined along Pennsylvania Avenue. Journalists shuffled their notepads, camera shutters clicked relentlessly, and Secret Service agents adjusted their woolen coats against the biting wind. Inside the White House, the final preparations of a presidency were underway. Outgoing President Harry S. Truman, 68 years old, had spent the past 8 years steering the country through the turbulent aftermath of World War II and into the early tensions of the Cold War. His figure, slightly stooped from decades of political maneuvering, moved briskly through the familiar corridors, the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He knew that by noon he would hand over the reins of power to a man he had once admired, a former military colleague whose ascent to the presidency had been almost inevitable. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the incoming 34th president, was stationed in the inaugural reviewing stand across the National Mall, standing tall in a dark overcoat, his crisp military posture a relic of years commanding Allied forces across Europe. His eyes, usually calm and unflinching, flicked toward the White House with a mixture of calculation and unease. The moment of approach, when tradition dictated that the president-elect would enter the executive mansion to greet the outgoing leader, loomed ahead. But there was a tension in the air that no ceremonial music could mask, a silent storm shaped by politics, pride, and unresolved grievances. Few knew the full story behind this unusual coldness. Just 6 years earlier, Truman had extended an extraordinary offer. In 1947, he had privately proposed stepping aside to allow Eisenhower to assume the presidency, believing the general's leadership could unify a fractured nation. Eisenhower had refused, citing his own sense of duty and political caution, but the memory lingered. By 1952, the campaign had introduced new strains. Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations of communist infiltration and Eisenhower's careful navigation around the revered General George Marshall had sown seeds of suspicion. Now, on this frigid January morning, the centuries-old tradition of cordiality between outgoing and incoming presidents hung by a thread. Inside, Truman's aides prepared him for the ceremonial exit. His secretary, looking pale against the winter light, whispered reminders of protocol. A handshake at the door, a few moments of friendly conversation. Truman's eyes, however, betrayed a mix of frustration and sadness. He had expected civility. He had expected that Eisenhower, the man who had once served under him in a shared national cause, would honor not just the office, but their past camaraderie. Outside, the crowd murmured, sensing the subtle tension. The brass of military bands gleamed under the low sun, awaiting the signal to play, while reporters leaned forward on their press risers, pencils poised. The cameras captured every small gesture, every stiff turn of the head. And then, in a decision that would shock the nation, Eisenhower would break with tradition in a moment that would reverberate through presidential history. He would refuse to cross the threshold of the White House. This was not mere protocol. This was a confrontation of pride, principle, and politics, wrapped in the fragile veneer of public ceremony. And it was about to unfold in full view of a nation watching every calculated step. The story of Truman and Eisenhower did not begin with frost and ceremony. It began in the crucible of war, where camaraderie and shared purpose often forged bonds stronger than politics. It was 1943, and the world was engulfed in conflict. Eisenhower, then a relatively untested American general, had risen swiftly through the ranks, his strategic acumen earning him a reputation as a steady, calm hand amidst chaos. Truman, a senator from Missouri, observed the war's progress from Capitol Hill, reading military dispatches and hearing reports from colleagues. Though their paths had crossed only briefly at official gatherings, Truman's admiration for Eisenhower was genuine. By the war's end, Eisenhower had become supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, the architect of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion that would change the course of history. His calm decisiveness in the face of German fortifications on Normandy's beaches had saved thousands of lives and cemented his reputation as a hero of democracy. Truman, now president after Roosevelt's sudden death in April 1945, recognized in Eisenhower a figure of rare integrity. When he met Eisenhower in person at the White House, the two men shared a handshake that seemed to promise not only respect but mutual understanding. Their interactions in the late 1940s seemed to confirm this growing respect. Truman, confronting the post-war challenges of rebuilding Europe, containing communism, and managing the early Cold War, frequently sought Eisenhower's counsel. In 1947, Truman's admiration reached an extraordinary point. He reportedly offered to step aside and let Eisenhower assume the presidency, believing the general could unify a politically fractured nation and restore public confidence. Eisenhower, though flattered, politely declined. He insisted that he could not enter politics so directly, citing a sense of duty to remain above partisan conflict. Yet beneath the surface of friendship, subtle tensions were brewing. Eisenhower's eventual decision to run for president in 1952 had not been free of political maneuvering. Key figures, such as General George Marshall, acted as intermediaries, balancing loyalty to both men. Marshall, whose influence Eisenhower respected immensely, advised careful diplomacy, but even he could not quell the whispers and the political undercurrents that grew louder with McCarthyism's rise. Senator Joseph McCarthy's relentless accusations of communist infiltration polarized the country, and Truman, ever forthright and uncompromising, was increasingly critical of the climate Eisenhower seemed to navigate with caution. By 1952, the public saw a polished Eisenhower campaigning on promises of peace and strong leadership, while Truman's administration was weighed down by controversies over Korea, inflation, and domestic unrest. Private correspondence revealed growing bitterness. Eisenhower, though careful to maintain public neutrality, harbored resentment over perceived slights and Truman's stubborn loyalty to political allies he found objectionable. Truman, in turn, felt personally betrayed, convinced that Eisenhower's entry into politics had undermined some of the post-war initiatives he had labored to secure. As the Inauguration Day of 1953 approached, the once respected camaraderie had hardened into mutual caution. The world saw a smooth electoral transition, the orderly rotation of power that had defined American democracy. Yet behind the cameras and the fanfare, two men who had once shared the burden of global war now stood on opposite sides of an invisible battlefield, where tradition, loyalty, and personal pride would collide in a moment destined to become legendary. Summer 1952. The heat hung over the nation as political fervor reached a fever pitch. Eisenhower, still a celebrated general, now wore the new mantle of presidential candidate. His campaign team moved with precision, speeches rehearsed to the word, parades orchestrated with military precision, and television cameras capturing the genial, reassuring smile of a man the public trusted with both the horrors of war and the anxieties of peace. Meanwhile, Truman remained in the background, a figure both respected and increasingly scrutinized. His administration had been mired in controversy. The Korean War dragged on without decisive victory, inflation gnawed at American households, and accusations of corruption haunted several federal offices. Public opinion, once glowing for wartime achievements, had cooled. Truman's approval ratings reflected the frustration of a nation yearning for optimism and a new face of leadership. Yet the tension between the two men was more than political optics. It was personal. Eisenhower's campaign carefully avoided directly attacking Truman, but the unspoken comparisons were everywhere. Public speeches lauded stability, strong leadership, and unity. Subtle critiques of Truman's perceived indecision. Truman, sharp and uncompromising, interpreted these as not just political maneuvering, but as a slight against his own judgment. Adding fuel to the fire was the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose anti-communist crusade injected fear into American politics. Eisenhower, cautious by nature, carefully distanced himself from McCarthy, never fully endorsing the senator's reckless accusations. Truman, however, saw McCarthy's methods as a dangerous poison threatening the very fabric of democracy he had fought to protect. When Eisenhower remained publicly neutral, Truman read it as tacit approval or at least moral ambivalence. Even decades of military camaraderie could not override this chasm of principle. Meanwhile, George Marshall, Eisenhower's mentor and a mutual friend of both men, tried to mediate discreetly. He advised Eisenhower to maintain respect for Truman, emphasizing that personal diplomacy could ease tensions during the transfer of power. Yet Eisenhower, mindful of his own reputation and determined not to appear manipulated or indebted, weighed each move with a meticulous calculation of a general preparing for battle. By Election Day, November 4, 1952, the stage was set for a decisive shift. Eisenhower won in a landslide, a reflection of both his personal popularity and the electorate's desire for new leadership. But the victory, though publicly celebrated, left the fissures between Eisenhower and Truman unresolved. The general's rise had been supported by a coalition of voters and political operatives Truman distrusted. The personal respect once shared had been overshadowed by political pragmatism, ideological disagreements, and unspoken resentments. As January 1953 approached, these tensions became a powder keg. Public ceremonies could not mask private grievances. The tradition of the president-elect visiting the outgoing president at the White House, a gesture of respect and continuity, now carried an almost unbearable weight. Every footstep along Pennsylvania Avenue, every handshake expected in the White House foyer, was loaded with history, pride, and the bitter echoes of decisions made in the glare of public scrutiny. Eisenhower's staff, aware of the delicate situation, debated endlessly. Should he maintain tradition, risking a perceived compromise of principle, or should he assert his autonomy, sending a quiet but unmistakable message that the old administration's authority and perceived moral judgments would not dictate his presidency? The choice would reverberate far beyond the frost-lined steps of the Capitol, signaling to the nation the complex interplay of loyalty, leadership, and personal honor. January 20th, 1953. Dawn broke over Washington with a sharp, crystalline clarity. Snow dusted the lawns of the White House, and the air smelled faintly of charcoal and winter pine. Inside the executive mansion, Truman moved through familiar corridors one last time as president, adjusting the lapels of his overcoat and listening to the soft murmur of aides and Secret Service agents. Every creak of the polished floors seemed to echo the gravity of history in motion. Outside, the National Mall teemed with spectators wrapped in heavy coats and scarves, craning to glimpse the pageantry. Bands stood ready to play the solemn strains of Hail to the Chief and patriotic marches. Camera crews positioned themselves on scaffolding, their lenses trained on the approaching motorcade. Every detail mattered, every gesture, every glance, because the nation would read intention and respect, or the lack thereof, in even the smallest act. Eisenhower, standing tall in his dark wool coat and gloves, surveyed the scene with the unflinching gaze of a commander. His aides briefed him one final time: the schedule, the protocols, the expectations. Yet the moment that weighed heaviest on him was not on the reviewing stand or before the cameras. It was the moment when, according to tradition, he would step into the White House to greet Truman. This visit, simple on paper, was loaded with decades of camaraderie, conflict, and unspoken grievances. As the motorcade rolled up to the White House gates, Truman emerged on the portico. The camera shutters clicked, capturing a president who had been at the helm through World War II, the dawn of the Cold War, and Korea's unresolved conflict. He extended a hand, a gesture meant to signal continuity, civility, and the dignity of the office. For Truman, it was a simple act, a handshake, a smile, perhaps a few words exchanged before stepping aside to let a new era begin. Eisenhower paused. His boots crunched against the frost-hardened gravel. The wind tugged at his overcoat. The cameras followed his every movement. And then, in a move that would shock the assembled crowd and the nation watching on television, he turned away from the White House entrance. He did not cross the threshold. He would not meet Truman there. The silence that followed was palpable, heavier than the winter air itself. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Journalists froze mid-sentence, unsure how to describe what they had just witnessed. Truman's face, usually open and expressive, tightened with a mix of surprise, hurt, and controlled indignation. His aides exchanged nervous glances. The act, though silent, spoke volumes. A deliberate break from tradition, a visible manifestation of the personal and political distance that had grown between two men who had once shared mutual admiration and trust. The symbolism was unmistakable. Eisenhower's refusal was not a casual slight. It was a calculated message. Loyalty, principle, and political disagreement had collided in a moment that would define public perception for years. The cameras caught Truman's steady posture, the forced composure masking his private disappointment. Eisenhower's deliberate choice to remain outside the threshold signaled that his administration would chart its own course, independent of the shadow of Truman's legacy. For historians, the moment encapsulated the fragile balance between public ceremony and private sentiment. For the men themselves, it crystallized years of complex feelings: respect and rivalry, camaraderie and caution, admiration and resentment. The nation witnessed a breach of tradition, yet few could fully grasp the tangled web of history, politics, and personal judgment that had brought them to this quiet confrontation on a frosty January morning. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken questions. Truman's aides scrambled to maintain decorum, whispering updates and reminders of protocol. Yet the president's mind was elsewhere, replaying years of history in rapid succession. The moments of shared struggle with Eisenhower during the war, the private discussions about the post-war world, the extraordinary offer he had made in 1947 to step aside for the general. All of it now felt overshadowed by a single public act of perceived rejection. Truman, ever blunt and self-assured, struggled to mask his hurt. He had expected civility, if not warmth. He had assumed that Eisenhower, the man he had once trusted implicitly, would honor the traditions of office, if only for appearances. His aides offered reassurances. "It's protocol, sir. It doesn't mean anything personal." But Truman's instincts told him otherwise. The refusal to enter the White House was more than symbolic. It was a rebuke, a calculated statement about independence and authority, and perhaps a subtle critique of Truman's presidency. Minutes stretched as Truman watched Eisenhower take his place on the reviewing stand, greeting the crowd with his familiar, confident smile. The president's eyes narrowed slightly, noting every measured gesture, every carefully framed photo opportunity. The contrast could not have been more vivid. One man inside the walls of power, confronting the reality of leaving office, and another standing outside, poised, controlled, and resolute, commanding the attention of a nation. Privately, Truman's reflections were sharper still. He considered the political currents that had shaped their rift. The 1952 campaign, the careful distance Eisenhower had maintained from McCarthy, the careful balance around George Marshall's influence, and the quiet tensions simmering under the surface for years. He recognized Eisenhower's skill as a strategist. After all, this was a man who had orchestrated one of the largest and most complex military operations in history. But the coldness cut deeper than any political critique. It was personal. Despite the sting, Truman adhered to his own principles. He would not publicly react with anger. He would complete the ceremonial duties of the day with dignity, shaking hands with dignitaries, delivering his final statements, and exiting the stage of history on his own terms. But the emotional weight of the refusal lingered, shaping the public narrative and private reflections alike. For historians looking back, Truman's response reveals a man balancing pride, hurt, and statesmanship. He understood the broader implications. The peaceful transfer of power remained intact, yet the human dimension, the fragile bonds between leaders, had been strained to its limits. The moment would echo in letters, memoirs, and oral histories, a reminder that even the most respected leaders are subject to the frailties of ego, pride, and unresolved tension. Outside, Eisenhower's aides moved quickly, ensuring the newly elected president maintained his composure and schedule. Inside, Truman paused for a moment at the Oval Office doorway, casting a final glance at the room he had inhabited for 8 years, a place now shadowed by the absence of the ritual handshake that had been denied him. History would note the facts, but only those who witnessed it could feel the quiet fracture between two men who had once been allies in both war and vision. From Eisenhower's perspective, the decision was far from impulsive. Standing on the reviewing stand, his eyes swept the assembled crowd, military officers, and dignitaries. To the public, he radiated calm confidence, the seasoned poise of a general accustomed to difficult decisions under pressure. But beneath the composed exterior lay a deliberate, almost surgical calculation. Every action on this day had consequences, symbolic, political, and personal. Eisenhower had long wrestled with a legacy of Truman's presidency. He respected the office and the historical continuity it represented. Yet he was wary of appearing indebted to a predecessor he now viewed with a mixture of admiration and mistrust. Truman's public and private decisions, his handling of McCarthy, his loyalty to certain political figures, and the unresolved tensions surrounding George Marshall had created a subtle but persistent friction. To cross the White House threshold and exchange formal pleasantries might have implied acquiescence or alignment with policies Eisenhower quietly disagreed with. The general's aides whispered, urging caution. "It's tradition, sir. It's expected." Eisenhower nodded, acknowledging the historical norm, but his mind remained fixed on principle. In his eyes, entering the White House would have been a concession, a softening of independence before his administration had even begun. Instead, he chose a silent, powerful gesture, one that conveyed firmness without confrontation, resolve without insult. Every historian who later studied the inauguration noted the tension in the air, visible even to those watching from the National Mall. Eisenhower's posture was impeccable, his gaze steady, his handshake with dignitaries firm yet measured. The public saw a confident, composed leader. What they could not see were the layers of political calculation, the careful weighing of symbolism against personal principle, and the invisible message sent to Truman. The incoming administration would be its own, unbound by personal expectation. Even as the motorcade departed from the Capitol, moving toward the White House and the promise of a new era, Eisenhower's decision lingered in the collective consciousness. Journalists scribbled notes, capturing the refusal, speculating on motives, and debating the meaning of the unprecedented gesture. To Eisenhower, it was a simple assertion of autonomy. To Truman, it was a public rebuke. To history, it became an enduring symbol of the complex interplay between personal loyalty and political necessity. The silence between the two men, a silence pregnant with decades of friendship, rivalry, and mutual respect, would endure for years. It was a quiet reminder that leadership often requires decisions that honor principle over tradition, that respect for oneself can, paradoxically, create friction with those once closest. The moment Eisenhower refused to enter the White House marked the beginning of a profound, almost decade-long estrangement between the two men. For the next several years, correspondence between Truman and Eisenhower was sparse, formal, and cautious. They had once shared confidences in strategy rooms and private discussions about the future of the nation, but now every word was measured, every interaction mediated by aides and political necessity. Truman, having returned to private life in Independence, Missouri, threw himself into public speaking and writing, reflecting on his presidency and the challenges of post-war America. His letters occasionally reached Eisenhower through official channels, but replies were terse, adhering strictly to protocol. In the public eye, both men maintained a veneer of civility, yet privately, the absence of personal communication underscored a deep and lingering tension. The estrangement was about more than personal pride. It was emblematic of the ideological and political divisions shaping the early Cold War era. Truman's aggressive anti-communism, his loyalty to certain political allies, and his forthright critiques of the administration's predecessors clashed with Eisenhower's cautious pragmatism, his careful neutrality in sensitive political disputes, and his commitment to maintaining personal autonomy. Even when policy discussions called for consultation or historical insight, the silence endured. Eisenhower, in particular, moved carefully, balancing the weight of his own presidency against the symbolic act of reconciliation. He respected Truman's legacy, understood the historical importance of continuity, yet he also recognized that any overt gesture too early could be misinterpreted by the public or political allies as weakness. The nation, watching from a distance, was largely unaware of the personal cost of this silence, the cold, unspoken tension between two men whose shared history had once been a source of strength. It was during this decade of quiet that the personal and political dimensions of leadership became starkly apparent. Decisions made in the public sphere, whether refusal to enter the White House or carefully phrased statements and speeches, reflected not just policy considerations, but the enduring impact of pride, principle, and the lingering echoes of friendship turned cautious respect. Each man moved through the political landscape aware of the other's presence, yet separated by an invisible chasm of unresolved grievances. Despite the silence, their paths would inevitably converge again in moments of shared loss and reflection, demonstrating that even the deepest rifts could be bridged by circumstance, history, and mutual recognition of service. But for the better part of a decade, the nation witnessed a rare and poignant absence. Two of its most significant leaders, once allies in war and vision, now distanced by politics and pride, navigating the early Cold War years in quiet estrangement. October 16, 1959. The air in Washington was cool, but heavy with solemnity as mourners gathered to honor George C. Marshall, the man who had shaped Allied strategy in World War II and influenced the course of American foreign policy for decades. Inside the National Cathedral, the atmosphere was hushed, punctuated only by the quiet rustle of coats and the murmured condolences of dignitaries. Among the attendees were two men who had once shared both friendship and profound tension, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. The funeral offered a rare, unavoidable convergence. Both men, bound by their shared history with Marshall, understood the gravity of the moment. Personal pride and lingering resentment were dwarfed by the weight of history and the respect owed to a man who had profoundly impacted both their lives. Truman, his face lined by years of public service and private disappointment, entered the cathedral with careful composure. Eisenhower, tall and steady as always, approached with his characteristic measured gait. The cameras captured the quiet exchange, a handshake, brief words spoken under the stained glass windows, and a mutual nod of acknowledgement. The decade-long silence, filled with unspoken tension and political calculation, was broken, not by ceremony or public statement, but by a shared recognition of loyalty and service. Witnesses recalled the scene as delicate yet powerful. Truman's eyes, once wary, softened. Eisenhower's posture remained composed, but there was a subtle relief in his expression. The two men, who had navigated the turbulence of war, politics, and ideology, found a moment of connection in mourning the man who had once been a mentor and moral compass to both. This reconciliation did not erase the past. The Inauguration Day slight, the political frictions, and the personal resentments remained etched in memory. But it marked a turning point, a recognition that even the deepest divides between leaders could be bridged through respect, shared history, and the acknowledgement of mutual humanity. For historians, the scene at Marshall's funeral symbolized the complexity of leadership. That strength, principle, and reconciliation are often intertwined, arriving in moments shaped by circumstance rather than ceremony. For Truman and Eisenhower, the handshake and quiet exchange were more than a gesture. They were a tacit acknowledgement that, despite the years of silence and unspoken grievances, the bonds forged in the fires of global conflict could withstand the pressures of political rivalry. The moment, solemn yet profoundly human, offered a glimpse into the private reconciliations that often remain hidden behind the public narratives of history. November 25, 1963. The nation was cloaked in grief. President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas just 3 days earlier, and Washington, D.C. was heavy with mourning. Flags hung at half-staff, the streets were lined with somber crowds, and the air carried the sharp tang of winter chill. Inside St. Matthew's Cathedral, the world's eyes were on the funeral procession of a fallen leader, but quietly, two former presidents observed from a place of shared history, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. The air between them was different this time. Gone was the tension of the 1953 inauguration. Gone were the unspoken grievances that had kept them apart for nearly a decade. Standing side by side, they reflected not on politics, but on the passage of time, on mortality, and on the enduring weight of leadership. The tragedy of Kennedy's death had reminded them, perhaps, of the fragility of life and the fleeting nature of power. Eisenhower, now fully ensconced in his post-presidential role, leaned slightly forward, acknowledging Truman with a nod. Truman returned the gesture, a small but unmistakable sign of restored respect. Both men understood that the world watched not only for ceremonial observances, but for the quieter, more human signals of reconciliation and mutual recognition. The silence of the past years had dissolved, replaced by shared grief and the acknowledgement of history's relentless march. For those who witnessed it, the moment was understated yet profound. The two men had traveled from camaraderie to conflict and finally to quiet understanding. Their handshake, brief words, and measured gestures spoke louder than any public statement could have. It was a demonstration of character, of the capacity to overcome personal pride, to recognize shared values, and to honor the responsibilities of leadership even in the shadow of national tragedy. This reconciliation, set against the backdrop of Kennedy's funeral, underscored a timeless lesson for students of history and observers of political life. Leadership is not only about the battles fought in offices or on fields of war, but also about the humanity retained in moments of discord, and the wisdom to restore connection when history demands it. For Truman and Eisenhower, it was a final, poignant acknowledgement that while politics can divide, shared experience, respect, and a sense of duty can endure beyond the rancor of the moment. Looking back from the vantage of history, January 20th, 1953, remains one of the most remarkable and human moments in American presidential lore. Eisenhower's refusal to enter the White House was more than a breach of tradition. It was a testament to the complex interplay of loyalty, principle, and personal pride that defines leadership. It revealed that even the most disciplined generals and seasoned presidents are not immune to the influence of personal sentiment and political tension. The incident became a case study in presidential behavior, often cited by historians and political scientists as an example of how personal relationships shape public governance. Eisenhower's silent statement communicated independence and self-assurance, but it also carried the inevitable cost of wounding Truman, a man whose sense of duty and honor demanded mutual respect. The nation witnessed a rare glimpse of leadership as lived experience, a collision of history, personality, and protocol. Yet, as the decade of estrangement demonstrated, time can bridge even the deepest divides. Reconciliations at George Marshall's funeral in 1959 and later at Kennedy's funeral in 1963 showed that mutual respect and shared history could restore what pride in politics had strained. These moments of quiet understanding underscored a crucial lesson. Leadership is not only measured by decisions in the public eye, but also by the capacity to recognize, forgive, and honor shared experience. For students of history, political enthusiasts, and admirers of World War II leadership, the Eisenhower-Truman relationship offers a vivid narrative of the costs and rewards of service at the highest level. It illustrates how two men, bound by war, tested by politics, and separated by pride, could navigate the turbulent currents of history and ultimately find reconciliation. The inauguration insult remains a powerful story, not of petty rivalry, but of human complexity at the center of power. It reminds us that the peaceful transfer of power, a cornerstone of American democracy, carries layers of personal drama, unspoken calculation, and the enduring tension between principle and tradition. And in that frosty January moment in 1953, we glimpsed not only the politics of a nation, but the private humanity of the men who shaped its destiny.